On December 24th, 1929, President Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou were holding a Christmas party. In attendance were several young children of his secretaries. The president was enjoying the festivities when a message was passed to him. He and his secretaries were urgently needed. In fact, rarely in history has a crisis so immediately demanded the attention of the chief executive. Christmas Eve at the White House in 1929 deserves to be remembered. For a century, the staff of the president worked on the second floor of the president's mansion, sharing space with the residence of the president and his family. This created problems in the 19th century as the quarters became quite cramped. The website of the White House, whitehouse.gov, explains various proposals were put forward during the late 19th century to significantly expand the president's house or build an entirely new residence, but these plans were never realized. Strangely, the issue would be pressed owing to an assassin's bullet. The assassination of President William McKinley in 1901 brought to the executive mansion Theodore Roosevelt and his family of 6 children. There simply was not room for the president's family and staff. In 1902, the president had a staff of 30 in the existing residence. Roosevelt made many changes to the White House and a renovation that cost $500,000. Among the most drastic alterations was to move the offices of the president's staff out of the residence and into a nearby and newly constructed temporary executive office building, placed on the west end of the West Terrace. The building was some 100 feet from the residence, connected by a colonnade. The Kansas City Star wrote in 1902 that President Roosevelt and his clerks and stenographers had installed themselves in the building until more pretentious quarters could be built. To the president's dismay, the new structure required the removal of the White House Conservatory, a massive and lovely greenhouse complex that included 2 rose houses, a camellia house, a grapery, a fern house, a geranium house, an orchid house, and a propagating house. In its original design, the president's office stayed in the main building, but the offices of his secretaries were moved. The building was not well regarded, sometimes called the Wart and the White House Barn. It would be some decades before it became regularly known as the West Wing. The White House Historical Association notes that members of Congress often refused to meet with the president in the new building, and Roosevelt still conducted much of his official work in his office. In 1909, Congress appropriated $50,000 to remodel the building, both for better aesthetics and more practical purpose. This renovation, during the administration of William Howard Taft, doubled the size of the executive office building. The new addition created an office for the president along the central axis of the building. Designed by architect Nathan Wyeth, the president's office was an oval shape, to match the famous Blue Room in the main building. In 1929, Herbert Hoover had renovated the floor plan to accommodate a larger staff. The Kansas City Times reported that Hoover found the arrangement of the executive offices unbusinesslike. The 3-month renovation allowed for the Times notes more commodious, agreeable, and better working quarters. At the time, the executive office building contained the office of the president, the cabinet office, a reception room, the offices of his 3 secretaries, and a press room on the ground floor, with room for the White House Corps of stenographers and quarters for the Secret Service in the basement. There was another half-story attic on top, which stored government papers. The Associated Press noted, through the executive offices, thousands of tourists have passed each week. 1929 was a difficult year. The stock market crash between September and November had wiped out some $14 billion in stock value, ushering in the worldwide Great Depression. The nation was facing an uncertain future at Christmas time, 1929. On Christmas Eve, the Hoovers were hosting a Christmas party in the White House residence. In attendance were 8 children, the young sons and daughter of the president's secretaries and personal physician. The Marine Corps band was playing Christmas carols in the hall. The Tampa Bay Tribune reported, the state dining room with its great chandelier was ashimmer with silver, shining through the red and green of the Christmas decorations which completely covered the Christmas tree. Opposite the tree sat a happy president, talking alternatively to Suzanne Boone, age 9, on his right, and Charles Ackerson, age 7, on his left. Erwin Ike Hoover entered the room. Hoover, no relation to the president, had been chief usher at the White House since 1909. He whispered in the president's ear, "The executive office is on fire. I want you to get your secretaries away from the table." His face instantly altered expression, the Times reported. All the men withdrew. The Wichita Eagle reported that the telephone operator had first noticed smoke coming from the upper half story of the executive office and called in the alarm. Russell Wood, a Secret Service man, had called the White House proper, and an operator there rang the fire department. Wood and other agents then tried to fight the fire themselves. The St. Cloud, Minnesota Times reported that Mr. Hoover had feared the outbreak of a fire at the White House, and at his direction the number of hand extinguishers was increased. Unfortunately, the paper wrote, the blaze was of such proportions, however, that these were inadequate to quell it. Meanwhile, the president, his secretaries, who were in attendance at the party, and the president's son, Alan Hoover, a student at Harvard University home visiting for the holidays, moved to rescue important documents from the president's office. The Reno, Nevada Gazette-Journal reported that, summoned from the dinner table, Mr. Hoover was among the first to reach the west wing of the White House after the alarm was sounded. Not heeding the smoke, which had begun to eddy thickly, he went into his office and began to carry out furnishings and documents. He was persuaded to leave the room with difficulty, and even then, he stood outside and aided others that were carrying out valuables. The Eagle reported that George Ackerson and Lawrence Richley, two of the president's secretaries, with Alan Hoover, carried the drawers of the president's desk from the smoke-filled building. The body of the desk, however, a large mahogany pedestal desk that had been ordered as part of the renovation under the Roosevelt administration, was too big to pass through the window. A quick-thinking Ike Hoover used a tarpaulin that was intended to be used as an awning at the New Year's Eve reception to protect the desk from water damage. But finally, only the firemen with masks could penetrate the dense smoke, and hope was abandoned for some important records. A fireman named Fred C. Stein pushed into the smoke and water-filled building and brought out safely the president's flag. The Gazette-Journal reported that all of the city fire apparatus in the central section of the Capitol responded to the alarm, including 19 engines and 4 truck companies. The Eagle wrote that at 9:40 p.m., smoke was still pouring out of the windows and the roof. Firemen inside the building were ripping into the walls, and 50 or more firemen were trying to uncover the blaze from the roof. The Gazette-Journal noted that the firemen encountered many difficulties in battling the blaze. The metal gratings at the ventilators had to be torn away, and then boxings of stout pine inside had to be broken through before water could be applied to the flames. The Eagle reported that the hoses had been run from every available hydrant, and water was being pumped into the building from between 25 and 30 nozzles. At times, a fireman pulled loose a piece of roof, and flames leapt skyward. The outside walls above every window were blackened by flames and smoke. Dozens of fire engines jammed Pennsylvania Avenue and the side streets surrounding the structure. In addition, the Gazette-Journal writes, the weather was bitterly cold, and a coating of sheer ice lay wherever water had fallen. The forming on the rungs of the ladders made for difficulty in getting nozzles to the effective points. Of course, a 4-alarm fire at the White House drew attention. The Eagle reported that the crowd that gathered about the grounds was augmented minute by minute, partially from groups leaving a Christmas tree, which the president had lighted nearby earlier in the evening. Hundreds of watchers were kept from the White House grounds by the police. Meanwhile, Lou Hoover had stayed with the children. The Tribune writes that Mrs. Hoover, mistress of many emergencies, including the Boxer Rebellion in China, carried the party onto its close in a manner gracious and serene. The band played on and on at her request as the children transitioned from the dining room to the East Room. Then Mrs. Hoover disappeared, and when she returned, it was to call the children around her. She explained to them that when their daddies left, they had to go because their offices were on fire. She asked the children if they'd like to go to the second story and see the smoke. Would they? 8 pairs of scampering feet were the answer. Through the poise and thoughtfulness of Mrs. Herbert Hoover, who has seen her historical events and values them, 8 unfrightened children will always be able to say, I watched from a White House window the White House fire of Christmas Eve, 1929. At 10:35, the Times reports the fire was pronounced under control, and 20 minutes later the fireman said it had been extinguished. 2 firemen had been injured, one with burns to his face from a backdraft and another overcome with smoke, who had to spend the night in a hospital. The Eagle described the building as 8 total loss and wrote that the entire lower floor was filled with water. The Gazette-Journal reported that Lieutenant Colonel U.S. Grant III, grandson of the former president and in charge of public buildings, said that the roof, ceiling, floors, and partitions would all have to be replaced. The Associated Press noted the sorry state of the president's office. The walls were stripped of all decorations, and only the desk used by the president remained of the little furniture usually there. It stood almost in the plumb center of the room, bereft of drawers and its surface completely empty. The windows had been robbed of their draperies. A solitary chair stood forlornly in one corner, water dripping from the ceiling. The floors were bare of rugs. All in all, the room appeared to be that of an apartment for rent, and apparently with little chance for receiving a tenant because of the waterfall and the consequent blemishing of the walls. The Gazette-Journal noted that in addition to the cost of reconstructing the building, There had to be reckoned in the value of files and other less tangible things lost. But not all was lost. The Times reported that all of the president's valuable confidential files were safely moved beyond the reach of the flames. Today, they were housed in the building usually devoted to the White House florist, closely guarded by soldiers. And the Eagle noted that the big green clock in the president's own office, which has kept time for a number of chief executives, was saved from the flames, largely because the office was the last to burn and a fireman was able to carry it out. It is resting comfortably in a big flower basket in the florist's room. It was not conclusively determined what had caused the fire, either an electrical short or a block flue from a fireplace, but in any case, the fire had quickly spread among piles of documents, most of them various government leaflets, some as much as 50 years old, that had been stored in the attic. Newspapers at the time noted that the Christmas Eve fire of 1929 was the worst fire to strike the White House since 1814, when the British burned it as part of the War of 1812. And it's hard not to see the symbolism of the White House executive office burning to the ground on Christmas Eve in the disastrous year 1929. It certainly felt like it was a portent of things to come. And of course, there is some irony in the fact that the executive offices were done in by the piles of outdated propaganda that they had left in their attic. The building was uninsured, and a special appropriation had to be made for the reconstruction. A contract was awarded in January, and the new building was completed by mid-April. The desk that Ike Hoover's tarp had saved is known today as the Roosevelt desk. It was brought back to the White House and used by President Truman, famously sporting a sign that said, "The buck stops here." Since 1963, the desk has served as the desk of the vice president. Maybe there's also some symbolism in the fact that the vice president's desk has survived a fire? But in the end, maybe the best message to take from the Christmas Eve White House fire of 1929 was the one that was taken by the children that attended the Christmas party. The Tampa Bay Tribune noted that viewing the fire from the second floor of the White House was the finale of the Christmas Eve party for the young guests. A short time later, they were courting sleep in order to hasten the advent of Christmas Day and attendant joys. That is to say that even with the fire, Christmas came nonetheless. From everyone here at the History Guy, have a very Merry Christmas. The American Christmas Tree Association estimates that around 77% of American households, some 96 million of them, will put up a Christmas tree this holiday season. And when you think of the tradition of Christmas trees, the first thing that comes to mind is probably not a massive explosion. But in fact, one of the most famous Christmas trees in America is intimately linked to one of the most devastating explosions in human history. It's a story of great tragedy and great heroism and great generosity that goes to the heart of the very meaning of Christmas. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Halifax is the capital of the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, including a large natural port on Canada's Atlantic coast. The city motto, Imari Mercies, means from the sea, we get our wealth. In fact, the location of the modern city on traditional lands of the Micmac peoples was called in the Micmac language Chibuktuk, meaning Great Harbor. That natural harbor was the reason that the British created a settlement there in 1749, sparking conflict with the Micmac. The harbor, the closest on mainland North America to Europe, did not just operate as a locus of trade on the Canadian Atlantic coast, but showed its value as a military base as early as the French and Indian War in 1754, where it was an important logistical base supporting the siege of Louisbourg. The strategic importance continued in the war-torn world of 1917. By then, the city had grown to include some 50,000 residents, 60,000 if you include the large number of troops, military personnel, and mariners passing through due to the war. Halifax was an important railway terminus, with troops and supplies flowing by rail from Canada and the United States to its harbor, where ships heading to the continent gathered to form convoys, a defense against the dreaded German U-boats. Millions of tons of supplies and hundreds of thousands of troops from Canada and the United States went through the bustling port, headed for the battlefields of the Great War. Among the ships using the busy harbor was the 5,043 gross registered ton steamship SS Emo. Built in Ireland in 1889 and sailing under a Norwegian flag, the Emo was chartered for the Belgian Relief Commission and in December was headed to New York City to collect relief supplies. Emo was supposed to leave the harbor on December 5th, but was delayed as her load of coal had arrived late. By the time the coal was loaded, the harbor's submarine nets had been raised, and she had to wait to depart until the next morning. Also transiting the harbor that December was the 3,121 gross registered ton French-flagged general cargo freighter SS Mont Blanc. The 18-year-old Mont Blanc was owned by the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, the French state-owned line that was responsible for French wartime shipping. She had left New York on December 1st, loaded with munitions, headed for Bordeaux and the battlefields of France. She was to join a convoy headed for the continent that was forming in Bedford Basin, a large enclosed bay that formed the northwestern end of Halifax Harbor. She had arrived on December 5th, but after the submarine net had been raised, and had to wait for the next morning to enter the harbor. At roughly 8:45 a.m. on December 6th, the Emo, empty of cargo, was leaving the port, headed for New York, while the Mont Blanc, laden with explosives, was entering the port, having just come from New York. The two ships were passing through a part of the harbor that was called the Narrows. Through the Narrows, ships were supposed to keep to starboard and pass each other port to port. But the Emo first encountered an American steamer, SS Clara, which was in the wrong lane. To avoid collision, Emo moved to port, and the two passed starboard to starboard. Emo was then forced even farther out of lane to pass a tugboat, and this meant that when the Emo encountered the Mont Blanc, entering the harbor, it was out of position, and the two were on a collision course. The two exchanged signals. Mont Blanc halted her engines, and Emo reversed hers, but that caused her bow to swing towards Mont Blanc. The result, the Halifax Evening Mail explained, of a right-handed propeller reversed while a steamer still had headway. The momentum of the two ships brought them together. The accident wasn't extreme. Estimates are that both ships had slowed to less than 1 knot before they collided. The damage to SS Mont Blanc wasn't severe, as the bow of the Emo struck her on the side. The people of Halifax and the city of Cambridge on the other side of the harbor had heard the boats signaling each other and had come out to see what the excitement was about. Most seemed to be wholly unaware of the disaster that was about to unfold. In normal times, an ammunition ship would not have been allowed into the harbor because of the risk of explosion, but that restriction had been relaxed due to the needs of the war. Owing to the explosives, the harbor pilot aboard Mont Blanc had requested a special guard ship to be assigned, but none had been. Typically, ships carrying munitions would fly a red flag to warn other ships of the danger, but the practice had been suspended due to the war and the fear of German spies. The Mont Blanc was not seriously damaged, but its deck included barrels of benzol, a highly flammable fuel. The collision had upset several barrels, spilling the fuel across the ship's decks, and as Emo reversed course and disengaged from the collision, it caused a spark, and the benzol ignited. The chief officer of the Mont Blanc would later testify that no human power could have extinguished the flames that almost immediately followed the collision. What's more, the ship's only hose was inaccessible because of the fire. The crew of the Mont Blanc quickly abandoned ship, and the ship drifted towards the port's dock number 6. Other ships, including a tug and a whaler, saw the fire and moved close to fight the fire with their hoses. The growing number of people watching from shore saw the smoke, but didn't realize what it meant, as the ship did not display the red flag indicating that munitions were on board. But the Mont Blanc was carrying 2,925 metric tons of high explosives. The chief officer later testified in court that the crew of the Mont Blanc tried to wave people away from the danger, but their message might have been misunderstood, as only one of them spoke English. At approximately 9:04, about 19 minutes after the initial collision, the Mont Blanc exploded. The explosion that would come to be called the Halifax Horror was the largest man-made explosion in history to that point. As the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic writes, in an instant, Mont Blanc was transformed from a ship to a 3-kiloton bomb in a busy modern harbor. The Mont Blanc mounted a 90mm gun on its foredeck, a defense against U-boats. The explosion was so powerful that the gun, its barrel melted, landed more than 3.5 miles away. The blast was heard 225 miles away on Cape Breton Island. The tsunami resulting from the blast was 60 feet tall. Every building in a radius of more than 1.5 miles was damaged. Estimates are that at least 1,600 people were killed in the initial blast, and thousands more injured or trapped in the rubble. Quickly, fires started from the lamps and stoves inside now-collapsed buildings. The Montreal Star wrote, to add to the horror, fire broke out in 100 places, and those who were pinned down by the debris met the most horrible death. The Star continued, the war has touched Halifax. Sorrow and anguish are left in its trail. Where only a few hours ago the most prosperous city in Canada stood secure in her own defenses, unafraid and almost apathetic, There are now heaps of ruins. No one could yet estimate the loss of life and property, and words fail to describe the mental anguish of those who have lost homes and dear ones by one cruel stroke. The crash came as suddenly and unexpectedly as the Zeppelin bombs have fallen upon undefended English towns, and the effect has been the same. The Saskatoon Daily Star wrote, "The sea, which had given Halifax its wealth and placed it on the highest rung of the ladder of prosperity, has showered disaster upon the hitherto favored city with as lavish a hand as had ever showered prosperity." It would be too much to try to explain the severity of loss or the extent of the heroism by the people in the midst of disaster. A telegraph dispatcher sacrificed his life to warn oncoming trains of the impending explosion. His last dispatch read, "Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." A leading citizen climbed aboard a burning barge, also loaded with munitions, and extinguished the fire, preventing yet another explosion. Halifax had the oldest fire service in Canada and boasted a new motorized American LaFrance pumper named Patricia, the first of its kind in Canada. Firemen of the brigade responded to the initial fire, bringing Patricia with them. When the Mont Blanc exploded, 8 men from the brigade were killed outright, and a 9th died later of his wounds. Halifax Magazine notes, "It remains the largest single loss of firefighter life in one incident in Canadian history." Fire brigades come from nearby communities, some traveling more than 100 miles by train, only to find that their hoses did not connect to the Halifax water sources. Halifax was in desperate shape. More than 1,000 dead, thousands more injured, fires still burning, and tens of thousands left homeless, open to the elements in the middle of a Canadian winter. While nearby communities responded quickly, the extent of the destruction required relief from farther away. Calls went out across Canada and the United States. Immediately, assistance came from many quarters, including the U.S. Navy protected cruiser USS Tacoma, returning to Halifax after escorting a convoy. The cruiser was hit by the waves caused by the blast, and seeing the rising cloud of smoke altered course to assist Halifax. The crew of the Tacoma provided security and aided in relief efforts. The ship was turned into a temporary hospital. Many of the initial reports describing the devastation came from the captain of the Tacoma. But one source of relief might have come as a surprise to some. Boston, Massachusetts. As the Boston Globe noted in 2017, the historical relationship between Boston and Halifax was not a friendly one. Nova Scotia had been the location where thousands of British loyalists from New England had fled following the American Revolution. During the War of 1812, privateers operated from Halifax, capturing more than 60 American ships. In 1813, the American frigate Chesapeake was captured outside Boston by the British frigate HMS Shannon. The prize had been taken to Halifax, and the captured American crews interned there. The military force that had burned the U.S. Capitol in 1814 had come from Halifax. And during the American Civil War, the Confederate blockade runner CSS Tallahassee had gotten repairs in Halifax, where the community had assisted in their nighttime escape from the harbor, allowing the rebel vessel to avoid pursuit by U.S. Navy ships. But, the Globe continues, these two shipping towns had more in common than most. Boston was home to thousands of Halifax cousins and transplants, including James Ernest McLaughlin, who had designed Fenway Park. It helped that in April 1917, the United States finally entered the Great War, becoming allies with Canada for the first time. Perhaps as importantly, Massachusetts had, in February, created a committee on public safety. Created by Governor Samuel Walker McCall, the committee was a response to the growing possibility that the United States would be drawn into the Great War. The governor wrote when the committee was formed, "I did not appoint the committee with the idea that war was probable. I am expressing no opinion upon that point. But I think we will all agree that war is at least possible. And as it is possible, it behooves us to do what we can to get the Commonwealth of Massachusetts where it may, as it always has in time of national crisis, respond very quickly to any call from the nation." If the governor was unwilling to speak on the probability of war, he certainly must have recognized it. The U.S. declared war on Germany on April 4th. The committee had established local committees throughout the Commonwealth with numerous responsibilities, including the medical preparation necessary to meet any emergency. That is, Massachusetts already had in place a system that was designed to provide a medical response to meet any emergency. Less than 2 hours after the explosion, Governor McCall sent a telegram to the mayor of Halifax, Peter Francis Martin, reading, "Massachusetts ready to go the limit in rendering every assistance you may be in need of. Wire me immediately." The mayor was understandably unable to respond immediately. McCall called a meeting with his committee. The committee contacted their connections, and the head of the Boston and Maine Railroad promised a train if the governor could fill it. McCall didn't wait for a response from Halifax. The train left Boston filled with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies at 10 p.m., just 12 hours after news had first reached Boston of the disaster. On December 7th, a blizzard, one of the largest in the history of the Maritimes, struck, and the train was stuck in deep snowdrifts. The rescuers needed to be rescued themselves, but the train arrived the next day, just 2 days after the explosion. Owing to McCall's committee, the desperately needed medical relief from Boston arrived even before that of other Canadian provinces. The Globe quoted noted Halifax historian Thomas Roddall, an explosion survivor. Doctors and nurses arrived from outlying provincial towns, and substantial help was on the way from Montreal and Toronto. But the first and most valuable assistance came from the ancient foe from beyond the Bay of Fundy. Another train from Boston arrived on the 9th, this one carrying equipment for a hospital. The Boston steamship Calvin Austin, chartered by the U.S. Shipping Board, was delayed by the storm but arrived on the 11th. According to the Canadian military history magazine Legion, cargo included 985 packages of mattresses, 591 cots, 86 bundles of pillows, 200 bags of flour, 115 cases of canned beef, 200 cases of canned beans, 62 cases of coffee, and 26 cases of tea. There were shoes, crackers, glass for windows, roofing, clothing, bread, and even margarine. A second ship was already underway, this one the Northland, according to the December 11th, 1917 edition of the Globe, carrying $2,000 worth of shoes, $4,000 worth of roofing, $8,000 worth of stockings and gloves, and $10,000 worth of rubber goods, $4,000 worth of glass, $15,000 worth of miscellaneous supplies, and 10 heavy trucks that could be used to distribute supplies, valued at $25,000. Noted Canadian author Nellie McClug was quoted in the Globe. Even this disaster has brought us closer together, and I have no words to tell you the appreciation of the Canadian people for the willing help that has been given. And the aid continued. The Globe wrote in 2017, and this was only the beginning. Financed entirely by American funds, the Massachusetts Relief Commission continued its clinics and its housing and welfare work in Halifax long after the disaster, a memory cherished by the Haligonians to this day. Among the aid given was the construction of an apartment building to house refugees from the explosion. The building was dubbed Governor McCall Apartments. The website of the City of Boston notes that the apartment building sheltered nearly 320 families, or 2,000 people. And in the wake of the disaster came a Christmas tradition. The City of Boston webpage continues. Many of the Bostonians who found themselves in Halifax for the Christmas of 1917 decorated the hospitals where they worked, putting up Christmas trees and other decorations. A year later, in December of 1918, Nova Scotia sent a Christmas tree to Boston as a thank you for Boston's help after the explosion. In 1971, Nova Scotia revived the tradition, with a tree donated by the Lunenburg County Christmas tree producers until 1976, when the government of Nova Scotia took over the donation to continue the goodwill gesture and to promote trade and tourism. Of course, Halifax got aid from all over the world, not just Boston, and other Canadian provinces and other U.S. cities were also very generous, but the speed and breadth of the Boston response has never been forgotten in Nova Scotia. It stands as a symbol. John Bacon, who in 2017 wrote a book on the Halifax explosion, was quoted in the Boston Globe. On November 30th this year, the people of Boston will light the Christmas tree, a testament to a time when the worst the world could inflict brought out the best in two countries. The Sable Point Lightkeepers Association estimates that there are nearly 1,500 shipwrecks on Lake Michigan. One of those is the three-masted schooner Rouse Simmons. On November 23, 1912, the schooner passed the Kewanee Life-Saving Station, flying a flag of distress, disappeared into the fog and snow, and was never seen again. The loss of the ship that was known affectionately throughout Chicago as the Christmas Tree Ship is symbolic of the risks taken by the vessels and sailors who braved the storm-ridden Great Lakes. The schooner Rouse Simmons was built in Milwaukee in 1868 by Allen McClelland and Company. She was built at the zenith of Great Lakes trade, with more than 1,800 vessels sailing. She was named for Rouse Simmons, the businessman, a prominent Kenosha politician and businessman who helped arrange financing for the ship. Schooners had become popular cargo ships, especially in coastal waters in the Great Lakes after 1800. They required fewer crew than square-rigged ships and were generally used in the U.S. to carry bulk cargo like coal and timber. The timber trade exploded on the lakes, carrying wood from Wisconsin, Michigan, Canada, and the Upper Peninsula south to ports in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Ontario. The trade began in earnest around 1830. One of the largest markets for northern timber was the growing city of Chicago. Chicago was organized in 1833 with a population of about 200 people, but grew quickly. By 1840, it had a population of 6,000 and was one of the fastest-growing cities in the world for several decades following. The city grew to 1 million people by 1890. The first lumber mill in Chicago was built in 1833, and soon timber began to be delivered in earnest. Huge lumber yards grew in Chicago, which became a central piece of the lumber trade. A canal opened in 1848, which allowed trade from the Great Lakes to reach the Mississippi River, and Chicago became a hub of trade between the eastern and western states. The lumber trade was especially vital to the city after the Great Fire in 1871, and in the year following, more ships entered the port of Chicago than in New York, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston combined. The Simmons first sailed out of Milwaukee, was owned by Royal B. Tousley. In a few years, the Simmons was purchased by Charles H. Hackley, a lumber magnate from Muskegon, Michigan, and joined a large fleet that delivered lumber from mills to ports around the lake. She served as part of Hackley's fleet for 20 years, and records from the U.S. Customs Service show that in 1883, Simmons was making almost weekly runs from Grand Haven, Michigan to Chicago, likely carrying lumber. 3 years before the Simmons was built, Herman Schuneman was born in the town of Onapee, now Algoma, Wisconsin. He was one of 6 children, and his eldest brother August was born in 1853. August was the first to make his living on sailing ships on the lake, but Herman soon followed. By the 1890s, both lived in Chicago. Schuneman and his brother were especially known for Christmas tree runs, among the last sailing runs of the year before ice and weather make the lakes impassable. The Schunemans were part of a large German immigration that peaked in the 1800s. In 1882, 250,000 German immigrants arrived in the United States, part of nearly 1.5 million who immigrated over the decade. The millions of German immigrants brought with them German culture and played a significant part in popularizing the Christmas tree in the United States. Many of these Germans moved to the Midwest, where in 1850 they made up 1/6 of Chicago's population. The lack of plentiful evergreen trees near Chicago made the late-year Christmas tree shipments lucrative, especially for men like Schuneman, who sold these trees directly to consumers instead of to middlemen in the city. Schuneman commanded numerous schooners in his career, including George Wren, the Bertha Barnes, and the Mary Collins. The number of Christmas tree ships is uncertain and fluctuated year by year, but the National Archives estimates that perhaps 24 ships made the late-season delivery in an average year. August started in the trade first, starting in the mid-1870s, and Herman followed, beginning around 1887. According to an 1897 article in the Chicago Sunday Chronicle, it was August Schuneman who first brought Christmas trees across the lake to Chicago in 1876. Living in Chicago, Herman Schuneman married Barbara Schindel, a German immigrant, on April 9, 1891. They had 3 daughters, Elsie, born in 1892, and twins Hazel and Pearl in 1898. Anyone relying on shipping in the lakes knew that they would spend the winter unable to sail, and Herman subsidized his shipping by starting businesses in Chicago. In 1906, he owned a saloon, but he petitioned for bankruptcy in January 1907 with $1,300 in debt that he couldn't pay. At Christmas time, the Schunemans would sail ships into Chicago, where they would dock their ships in the Chicago River, where they sold trees, garland, and wreaths on the deck of their ship. Hired women, a newspaper reported scores of women, would decorate the ship with garland and bring electric lights. A report from the Chicago Inter-Ocean in 1899 described Schuneman's operation. With 50 young girls weaving wreaths and garlands by hand, when they have completed their task, an emerald cable long enough to reach from Chicago to New York will have been braided by their deft fingers. The paper reported that he had been in business for 7 years past. In 1899, he brought 12,000 trees, including a 34-foot-tall tree, which was perfectly pear-shaped. He sold the tree for between 50 cents and $1. A reporter who knew the captain personally remembered the Christmas season didn't really arrive until the Christmas tree ship tied up at Clark Street. In 1898, Herman's brother August purchased the ship S. Tal, a 2-masted schooner, for $650, which had just been sold at auction by U.S. Marshals. The former owner had failed to pay his ship cook $66, and the ship was ordered sold in court to satisfy the debt. August was sailing ship back to Chicago in November when it was caught in a particularly rough storm. The ship was sighted off Glencoe, Illinois, struggling against large waves and wind. The Thal eventually dropped anchor in an attempt to weather the storm, but the storm only grew worse, with wind speeds reaching 60 miles per hour. A witness reported that the Thal tried to get underway, only for the wind to tear the foresail to shreds and toss the vessel as if it were a mere log. The ship disappeared into the fog. Seems to have been smashed to pieces on a sandbar. There were no survivors. August died just a month after the birth of Herman's twins. Sailing on the lakes, especially in the late fall, was an extraordinarily dangerous business. But the tragedy didn't stop Herman from continuing in the trade. He made a run the same year that August died, bringing in 11,000 trees. Each year he parked his ship at the southwest corner of Clark Street Bridge and dubbed his business the Northern Michigan Evergreen Nursery. Schuneman sold thousands of trees each year. In 1909, he reported that he only sold 15,000 trees, a paltry number, he thought, as the Chicago market depends pretty much on my supply. Herman's wife and daughters helped hawk the trees and other Christmas decorations in November and December each year. Herman became especially well known thanks to his penchant for giving trees to the poorest of Chicagoans free of charge. The newspaper dubbed him Captain Santa, a title he treasured. He kept newspaper clippings with the title in his oilskin wallet. Herman was not immune from the dangers of the lakes either. In 1898, he lost the Mary Collins when it ran aground, though all the crew survived. In 1908, while captaining the George Wren, he had nearly gone down with a ship in a storm, apparently with 50 women on board weaving wreaths. Last year, she nearly chucked the captain and his crew into Davy Jones' locker, he said. The ship survived the trip, but he replaced it with the Bertha Barnes in 1909, and in 1910 bought a share of ownership in the Rouse Simmons. When he bought it, the Simmons was almost as old as he was and had been sailing the lakes for more than 40 years. Like the S. Thal, the strategy of many of the Christmas tree ship captains was to buy older ships that still had a few years of service in them, though they, of course, risked more in the aged boats. By 1912, Schuneman owned a 1/8 share of the Simmons. A second captain, Charles Nelson, owned another 1/8 share, while Mans Bonner, a businessman from St. James, Michigan, owned a 3/4 interest. These were the twilight years of Christmas tree ships, and indeed sailing ships on Lake Michigan. Within a decade, schooners and masts would disappear, replaced by steamships and shipping by train. Schuneman, Nelson, and around 15 crew, including tree cutters, sailed for the Upper Peninsula in November to harvest trees from land Schuneman owned. The journey back to Chicago from near Thompson, Michigan, where he had harvested their trees, took about a week. On Friday, November 22nd, Schuneman prepared his ship to sail, loaded with an estimated 5,000 trees. Reports would later claim that Schuneman was warned by friends that the barometer was low and falling, evidence that a heavy storm was on its way. The Chicago American interviewed a man named Hogan Hoganson, supposedly one of Schuneman's crew, who claimed that he had left because the ship was overloaded and lacked lifeboats, and that even the rats had deserted it. Another crewman called Big Bill Sullivan later said that he had a hunch and went back to Chicago on the train. Professor Theodore Karamonsky, author of the book Schooner Passage, noted that the short hulls and buoyant cargoes of the lumber trade encouraged captains to overload their vessels, and Christmas trees were believed to be especially buoyant. Nevertheless, Rouse Simmons left the Upper Peninsula bound for Chicago that afternoon. The National Weather Service forecast only local rains or snow Saturday and variable winds from the northwest, but the storm proved worse than that. Weather grew worse throughout Friday and into the evening, with heavy rain turned to snow. Schuneman was a veteran captain who'd been sailing in the late fall on the lakes for decades, but in 1912 his luck finally turned. Reports of the storm would call it one of the worst on Lake Michigan in 3 years, and that heavy winds raised huge waves. Winds reached 60 miles an hour along the lakeshore. There was sudden nasty weather. The Sheboygan Press reported about the most sudden that I can remember. The Rouse Simmons was sighted in the afternoon on Saturday, November 23rd, around 2:50 p.m., by the Kewanee Life-Saving Station. Its flag was flying at half-mast to indicate distress. But Kewanee had no tugboat available, and the Simmons was continuing down the coast. At 3:10, the station keeper called the Two Rivers Station just to the south, and the powerboat Tuscarora was sent to meet the ship. But the Simmons was never seen again. What happened in the final hours isn't known. Sometime after she was sighted at 2:50 p.m., the Simmons went down. There were no survivors, and the only reports are 2 messages in bottles found after the wreck, neither of which are certainly from the Simmons. The first was reported in 1913 and read, "These lines were written at 10:30 p.m. Schooner Rouse Simmons ready to go down about 20 miles southeast of Twin River Point, between 15 and 20 miles offshore. All hands lashed to one line. Goodbye. It was signed Captain Charles Nelson. The second read Friday. Everybody goodbye. I guess we are all through. During the night, the small boat washed overboard, leaking bad. Ingvald and Steve lost too. God help us. This one was supposedly written by Schoenemann. Modern examinations proved that the Tuscarora was within sight of the location where Simmons went down by 4:20, but the snow of the storm started in earnest around 5 p.m. Christmas trees began to wash up on shore, though many more were trapped with the ship as it sank. The trees on deck may have been thrown over deliberately to lighten the ship's load or washed off. All hands lashed to one line makes sense if the other note is genuine and there have been crew members washed off the deck. The remaining crew would tie themselves together with rope and finally to the mast to prevent from being washed away. Though legend has made it seem that the ship was lost in a heavy storm, the weather on the afternoon of the 23rd was still clear, although the lake was rough. The ship's resting place wasn't found until 1971. A modern archaeological examination showed that the crew had attempted to drop their anchor, but they were too deep to safely anchor, but may have dropped the anchor to hold the ship into the wind. There is evidence that the deck fasteners may have failed. The overloaded ship, running low in rough water, sank fast. The ship had hit the lake bottom hard, throwing the rigging forward, dislodging 2 of her 3 masts and snapping the last. In 1924, a final message from the wreck was found when Captain Schoenemann's oilskin wallet was fished out of the lake, remarkably intact. It took days for the family in Chicago to start worrying, but reports in the first week of December slowly came into focus, making it clear that the Rouse Simmons was not going to limp home. Friends of the family offered a ship, and Schoenemann's wife and daughter sold trees that year from it. Trees recovered from the wreck were sold to benefit the families of the lost crew. The Schoenemann family was in dire straits that Christmas. Nearly all of their money had been invested in the Simmons cargo. Despite everything, Barbara Schoenemann and her daughter Elsie continued to sail the lakes and bring Christmas trees to Chicago, though they eventually brought in the trees by train. The captain's 3 daughters continued to sell trees even several years after Barbara died, in the 1930s. The story of the Rouse Simmons and the Schoenemanns covers much of the era of the schooner on the Great Lakes. Simmons was built during the heyday, but by the time that she sunk, she was one of only a few still plying the Great Lakes, and by 1920 there were almost none left. The Christmas tree ships like the Schoenemanns had a deep cultural impact on Chicago, and for decades later people remembered the days when Captain Santa brought his trees. The ship's wheel and one of the Christmas trees have been preserved, and the ship's anchor now sits at the entrance to the Milwaukee Yacht Club. Songs, plays, and other things have been written to commemorate the ship and her generous captain. Since 2000, the United States Coast Guard does a reenactment, bringing trees to Chicago for needy families. The Schoenemanns would be happy to know that the tradition has been kept alive. November of 1913, a year after the loss of the Rouse Simmons, the Chicago Daily News published an interview with Barbara when she said, "We'll load up the trees and tie it up at the old dock. The Rouse is gone, and her captain is gone, and her crew is gone, but Christmas will find the survivors still on the dock. And Chicago will have her Christmas trees as long as the Schoenemanns last." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.